Ohio, 1873. Harold had made a choice that would haunt him forever. He had sold his daughter. 8 years of her life, her laughter, her trust, traded for money he thought would secure their survival. The thought of it made his chest ache, and yet he could not undo it. He had believed it was the only way. Inside their small cabin, the fire burned low, shadows stretching across the rough wooden floor. The girl sat quietly in the corner, hands folded in her lap. She was small, barely 8, but already she noticed the things her father tried to hide. The twitch of his brow, the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze when the miller's name was mentioned. She sensed worry, even if she could not understand it. Harold forced himself to speak, voice low but steady. "I worry for you," he said. "I will do what I can to keep you safe." The girl looked up, eyes wide. "Father, will they be kind to me?" He swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he had handed her future to strangers, that every polite word, every coin received, carried cruelty disguised as care. But words like that would frighten her. Instead, he nodded. "They will care for you. But remember, your heart must guide you. Hold on to what is yours." The fire flickered. Shadows danced across the walls. Harold memorized every detail of her small form, the tilt of her head, the pale hands resting in her lap, the innocence he had put at risk. Each breath she took reminded him of his own cruelty. He had chosen comfort over freedom, safety over childhood, and every heartbeat screamed at him that he had done wrong. Outside, snow drifted against the cabin walls. The wind rattled the windows. Harold thought of the miller's letters that would soon arrive, polite, precise, filled with rules that would shape her days. Comfort would come, yes, but at a cost. Obedience, control, subtle chains imposed by strangers. He had done this for her, yet he had done it to her. The girl stirred, small hands curling around the thin blanket at her feet. Harold leaned close, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheeks, the innocence in her eyes. She was unaware of what was coming. She would not understand yet, but the weight of his choice would follow her like a shadow. He could see it already. The first letter from the millers, polite and careful. It would demand manners, chores, rules that seemed simple but would shape her life. Every instruction, every expectation, a reminder that he had traded her freedom for survival. He had acted out of love, yet cruelty had crept in. Harold sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the sleeping girl. He whispered silent apologies. The snow outside fell relentlessly, mirroring the storm in his heart. Regret pressed on him, heavy and unrelenting. He had believed survival justified the choice. But watching her, he wondered if comfort was worth this betrayal. Morning would come. The letters would arrive, and with them a new stage of her life would begin. Harold's conscience would not let him rest. Every polite word from the millers would remind him of what he had done, of the innocence he had imperiled, and the cruelty that had entered her life. The girl shifted slightly, dreaming. He watched her rise and fall with each breath. He memorized the curve of her small hands, the tilt of her head, the quiet trust she had placed in him. It was fragile, and he feared it would be tested soon. He could protect her only in small ways. The rules, the expectations, the polite demands would shape her, and he could do little to stop it. The fire popped. Shadows stretched across the walls. Harold's mind raced, imagining the miller's home, neat, orderly, controlled, the polite smiles that would hide strict rules, the polite words that would conceal subtle cruelty. He had sent her into that world, and he could not follow. Every polite gesture they offered would weigh on her, and he would carry the burden of this choice alone. He remembered the coin he had accepted, the handshake, the promises he had exchanged. Each action felt like a chain around his chest. He had acted out of desperation, out of love, out of fear of failing them both. But the weight of what he had done pressed on him, now like the snow pressing on the roof of the cabin. He had traded her freedom for comfort. Every thought reminded him of his guilt. Every heartbeat whispered regret. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the cabin was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Harold watched her sleep, wishing he could undo it. But there was no undoing a choice like this. No matter how much he loved her, no matter how hard he tried, he could not take back the act that would haunt them both. The letters would come tomorrow. Rules would follow, expectations, orders, subtle, shaping of her days that he could not prevent. His heart ached at the thought. And yet he had to believe, he had to hope that the Millers would at least keep her safe, that some kindness would exist alongside the control. He moved to the window, brushing snow from the sill, looking out across the frozen fields. The world was quiet, frozen and unforgiving, and yet inside a different storm raged, one of guilt, of cruelty, of regret. Harold knew he could not escape it. The girl's life had been altered, and he would carry the consequences. Every coin, every polite word, every handshake, they had brought this upon him. Clara stirred. A small hand reached out, brushing the blanket over her shoulders. Harold watched, memorizing every detail. Every line of her face, every expression of innocence, every small movement he could cling to, as a reminder of what he had chosen. The fire burned lower, shadows stretching further. Harold's thoughts drifted to the Millers' letters again. How polite they would be, how strict, how every instruction would shape her world. A world he had sold without her consent. He had done it out of love, yes. Out of fear, out of desperation. And yet the knowledge of cruelty, of betrayal, of regret, pressed down on him relentlessly. The girl shifted in her sleep, murmuring softly. Harold leaned closer. She was unaware of the full weight of his decision. She did not know that her freedom had been traded, that every day would now be guided by the polite rules of strangers, that subtle chains had been placed around her life, and he would bear the burden of that choice. Alone, snow drifted against the cabin walls. The wind rattled the windows. Harold sat near the fire, memorizing her, pledging silently to protect her as best he could, to soften the cruelty wherever possible, to shield her from what he could, even while knowing he could not stop the world from shaping her. He thought of the past, harsh winters, empty cupboards, frost-bitten nights. Survival had demanded hard choices, and this choice, cruel as it was, had seemed necessary. But necessity did not erase guilt, nor did it erase regret. Every polite word from the Millers would remind him of what he had done. Every expectation, every instruction, every rule would be a measure of his betrayal. Morning would come. Letters would arrive. Rules would be enforced. Expectations imposed. And he would watch, powerless as her world shifted. His cruelty and his regret would follow her, a shadow over every polite smile, every careful step. Harold sighed. He could not undo it. He had done this for her, yet he had done it to her, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. Every snowflake that fell against the cabin, every flicker of the fire, every breath she took, reminders of the choice that would haunt him forever. The first letter would arrive tomorrow. A new chapter would begin, and Harold's cruelty, his regret, and the moral cost of his decision would all follow. The snow had not melted, and the wind still cut through Millersfield with a cold sharpness that made the air feel brittle. Inside the small stone house, Harold moved with a heaviness that could not be explained by the weather alone. Each step he took across the worn floorboards carried the echo of a decision he could not undo. Clara hummed softly as she swept the hearth, her small hands moving with a rhythm that had once brought him comfort. Now it made the ache in his chest grow sharper. He avoided her gaze as much as possible, afraid that one glance would reveal everything, the fear, the guilt, the despair. Yet her eyes found him anyway, bright and curious, and he had to look away, pretending to measure grains or tend the fire. Every task became a reminder of what he had done, what he had sold. The coins he had received felt heavier with each passing moment, pressing into his conscience. Money could not restore trust, nor innocence, nor the future he had exchanged. Margaret watched him quietly, sensing a change she could not name. Her hands moved through domestic chores, her eyes following him from across the room. "You are troubled, Harold," she said softly. "Speak to me." He shook his head, lips pressed tight. Words would betray him before he could control them. How could he confess that he had sold his daughter, that he had bartered her life for a few coins? The thought of saying it aloud was unbearable. Harold left the house and walked into the fields, snow crunching beneath his boots. The frost painted the barren land in sharp white patterns, and every tree branch seemed to point at him, accusing. He imagined Clara's small figure walking into the Miller estate, polite, obedient, yet already trapped in a life arranged by his hands. His chest tightened, as visions of her innocence clashing with the cold, distant household he had chosen for her played in his mind. He could not rest. Every night he sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they held an answer he could not see. Clara slept in her small bed, unaware of the danger his choices had placed her in, and he envied her ignorance. Her trust had been absolute, and he had broken it, trading certainty for coins. The comfort he sought with the transaction was hollow. He felt the weight of every coin in his pocket as though each one were a nail driven into the fragile foundation of his morality. Clara began to sense the unease she could not yet name. She lingered closer to him, asked small questions about the Millers and the journey she would take. Her curiosity was innocent, but her eyes held a cautious watchfulness. Harold answered in vague phrases, careful not to reveal the truth, and the lie began to rot his tongue. Even the simplest interaction was now tainted, a reminder of what he had promised and what he had betrayed. The first formal letter arrived from the Millers, polite, precise, detailing arrangements for Clara's stay. Harold held it in his hand, reading it over and over, each line hammering the reality into him. They promised comfort, a warm room and steady meals. Yet the words could not erase the image of her small hands, her trusting smile, her innocence now to be handed over. Each promise of care felt like salt on an open wound. The wealth he sought had come at a cost that no gold could repay. He watched her every day with a mounting sense of dread. She laughed as she tended the animals, sang as she carried water, and he felt the sting of betrayal in every sound. He remembered the day he had shaken Mr. Miller's hand, the polished floors, the polite words that carried the weight of a sentence, and he shivered. The more Clara moved freely, the more he felt the cage he had built closing around her. Harold's hands were never idle, yet every task felt empty. Mending fences, stacking firewood, counting grain, all became exercises in punishment, ways to occupy himself while his conscience seared him. Each interaction with Clara was a mixture of longing and fear. Longing to protect her, fear that she would one day understand the depth of his betrayal. Every step he took, every word he spoke, carried the shadow of the choice he had made. The nights were worse than the days. Harold would lie awake, imagining Clara in the Miller estate, learning to obey, to smile politely, to exist under rules he could not dictate. The image was unbearable, yet he could not pull himself away from it. Sleep fled him entirely, replaced by visions of her, innocence colliding with a future, dictated by his greed and desperation. The coins he had counted repeatedly, during the day transformed into weights, on his chest, pressing him into the shadows of guilt he could not escape. Margaret tried to intervene, speaking in gentle tones, asking if he would talk. But Harold could not. Words would betray everything he had done. Every explanation would fall short. Silence was his only refuge, though it brought no comfort. The house itself seemed to reflect his inner torment. The creak of timber, the whistle of the wind through cracks, the cold seeping through the walls. It all conspired to remind him of what he had sold, what he had destroyed. Clara's questions became sharper. She noticed the tension, the careful avoidance, the way he flinched at her smallest inquiries. She could not understand fully, yet she sensed the weight pressing on the household, the shadow that had fallen over her father. She lingered closer, trying to read him, trying to find some reassurance in his behavior, and Harold's heart broke a little more with each glance she gave him. Harold wandered outside as dusk fell, the air cold and biting. He looked at the frozen landscape, imagining it as a mirror of his own life, harsh, unyielding, and incapable of reversing what had been done. Every tree branch, Every uneven clod of snow seemed to accuse him. He had taken a life of innocence and tethered it to necessity, and the moral consequence pressed on him like iron bands. Even in the routine of farm work there was no relief. Animals needed care, the fire needed tending, the house required cleaning. But every moment became a reminder of the choice he had made. Clara laughed as she gathered eggs, and he felt a sickening twist in his gut, knowing that soon she would leave his care for a household that would measure her in manners, obedience, and social advantage. The love that should have been freely given was now entangled in guilt and despair. The first night Clara prepared for the trip, Harold helped her pack a small bundle of clothes. Her small hands trembled with excitement, unaware of the weight her father carried. Each folded garment, each pressed scarf, was a reminder that he had exchanged her freedom for a promise of wealth. He could not voice his fear, could not tell her to turn back. The fire in the hearth burned low, flickering shadows across his troubled face. He imagined the future she would face, the polite smiles she would offer to strangers, the obedience demanded, and the innocence she would slowly lose. Sleep never came. Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks. The house was silent but heavy, as if it too mourned. He thought of every coin he had counted, every polite exchange with the Millers, every lie spoken to his daughter. The reality was inescapable. He had sold not only her future, but his own peace, his own honor, and the trust of the one he loved most. As the winter stretched on, the burden pressed heavier. Harold's movements became slower, his smiles rarer, his attention fractured. Clara's innocence and his own guilt formed a constant tension, a quiet storm inside the walls of the stone house. Margaret noticed the change, yet could not comprehend the depth. The act had been done, and now he lived under its shadow. Every glance at Clara, a reminder of a moral failing that could not be undone. Even the briefest moments, the sound of her laughter, the tilt of her head as she listened, were sharpened by regret. The wealth, the security, the promises, all meant nothing against the life he had pledged away, the trust he had broken. Harold understood that comfort and survival were hollow when measured against the cost of innocence and love. Clara had begun noticing subtle changes, though she could not yet name them. The light in her father's eyes was dimmer, the warmth of his hands less certain. He no longer laughed easily, no longer spoke with the calm authority that once made her feel safe. She watched him quietly, sensing the unease that lingered in the corners of their small stone house. "Father," she asked one morning, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes, "why do you look so worried?" Harold stiffened. The question struck him like a sharp wind cutting through frozen fields. He wanted to answer, to explain, to tell her that he had tried to protect her, that every coin he had counted carried the weight of his love, but he could not. Words would betray her, and perhaps even destroy the fragile trust that remained. "It's nothing, Clara," he said finally, voice tight and careful. "Just the farm." She studied him, the small frown on her forehead betraying her concern. He looked away, pretending to adjust the woodpile, but every movement betrayed his agitation. Clara's curiosity was natural, innocent, yet even that innocence began to carry questions he could not answer. Harold felt the weight of every decision pressing upon him more heavily with each passing day. The coins in his pocket, once a symbol of relief, now felt like nails driving through his conscience. He had sold his daughter, traded her freedom and innocence for a promise of comfort he could not verify. Every polite letter from the Millers reminded him of what he had done, and he began to imagine each moment of her life under their roof, learning obedience, manners, and perhaps even fear. Clara began asking about the Millers more directly. "Father, will they be kind to me?" she said one afternoon, her hands clasped tightly together. Harold's stomach twisted. He forced a smile. They will treat you well, my child," he said, though his own words rang hollow. Her trust in him was absolute, and each lie he told felt like another crack in the foundation of their bond. He could feel the shadow of guilt growing, creeping into every corner of the house, settling over him like a thick winter fog. The day came when Harold had to prepare Clara for her first visit to the miller's. He packed a small bundle of her clothing, her favorite scarf, and the little hand-sewn doll she clutched each night. Every folded garment felt heavier than the last, each scarf a symbol of innocence he could no longer protect. She watched him work, head tilted, sensing the tension but unable to name it. "Is something wrong, Father?" she asked softly. Harold shook his head. "Nothing at all, Clara, just a short trip," he said, forcing calm. The ride through the snow was quiet. The only sound the crunch of the sleigh runners over frozen ground. Clara sat close, her small hands clutching her bundle, eyes wide with curiosity. Harold's mind was a storm. He imagined the miller's polished floors, the polite smiles, and the strict rules she would encounter. Fear lanced through him, fear for her, fear for what he had set in motion, fear for the betrayal that would always haunt him. When they arrived, the millers greeted them with warmth that seemed rehearsed. Samuel's eyes lingered on Clara, polite but calculating, while Mr. Miller's smile carried a quiet authority. Clara hesitated, unsure of the new surroundings, and Harold placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the sharp pang of regret. She was small, trusting, innocent, and he had placed her in this world of arrangements, promises and control. The visit lasted hours. Clara obeyed politely, answered questions with a quiet voice, and smiled at the miller's hospitality. Harold watched, torn between relief and despair. She seemed unharmed, even content. But he could not shake the gnawing thought that her innocence was already being measured, evaluated, and appropriated for purposes he could neither control nor approve. Every polite smile she offered was a reminder of the life he had sold. On the ride back, Clara remained quiet, her small hands folded in her lap. Harold tried to speak, tried to offer comfort, but his own guilt made every word stumble. He wanted to assure her that she was safe, that he loved her, that he would never abandon her, but the truth was that he had already done precisely that. Each mile of the sleigh ride seemed longer than the last, the snowfield stretching endlessly, like the weight of his conscience. At home, the night pressed in. Harold sat by the fire, staring into the flames, imagining Clara under another roof, learning obedience, manners, and perhaps the first lessons of fear. He could hear her faint humming in her room, a small thread of innocence still intact, and it broke him to know that soon even that might change. Coins could buy her comfort, but they could never buy the trust he had promised, the freedom she had been born into, the love that should have been unconditional. Clara slept peacefully, unaware of the moral storm swirling around her. Harold watched her, memorizing the curve of her small hands, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair fell across her face. He felt a hollowness in his chest, the first seeds of regret spreading like a slow poison. Each heartbeat reminded him that he could never undo what had been done. He had sold his daughter, and the consequence of that choice would follow him every day. The days passed, each one a repetition of work, preparation, and silent guilt. Clara's innocence contrasted sharply with the weight of Harold's conscience. He watched her, guided her, and yet held back, afraid that his presence might remind her too soon of the betrayal. She could not yet understand. Every laugh, every question, every small gesture became a reminder of what he had sold, and each reminder tore at him more deeply. Letters from the millers arrived at intervals, polite, precise, and increasingly formal. Harold read them over and over, each line hammering the reality of the transaction into him. They promised safety, education, and care. Yet he could not shake the vision of Clara in a world he had chosen for her. Obedient, measured, constrained by rules he had no part in shaping. Each promise of comfort felt like a wound, each coin exchanged like a chain around his soul. One night, he wandered the frozen fields alone. The wind cut through his coat, biting at his face, and he imagined the snow as the weight pressing down on his conscience. Clara's laughter, the sound of her small hands patting the chickens, the innocence he had promised to protect, all of it was distant now, shadowed by his own choices. He understood more sharply than ever that survival and comfort were hollow when innocence and trust were the price. When Clara asked him about the Millers again, he spoke with careful reassurance. "They are kind, Clara, you will see," he said. Yet he knew the words were empty. Every polite gesture, every small kindness he spoke, carried the weight of what he could not prevent. She trusted him completely, and that trust was already fractured, even if she could not name the crack. The fire in the hearth flickered low, casting long shadows across the room. Harold sat close to Clara's small bed, memorizing her form, feeling the chill of regret deepen. He could see the consequences of his decision stretching ahead, invisible but inevitable, and every heartbeat carried a pang of moral despair. He had sold his daughter, and though she was safe, though she was unaware, the cost was already clear. And as the night deepened, Harold whispered quietly to himself, a plea that no one could hear, a promise that he would try, somehow to protect her in the limited ways left to him. Each coin had its price, each promise its weight, and he understood that the path he had chosen offered no relief, only regret and the hope that she might never fully understand the cruelty that had set the stage for the rest of her life. If you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. The morning light barely filtered through the frost-lined windows, yet Clara was already awake, moving quietly around the kitchen. Her small hands carried dishes and water with a careful rhythm, but her eyes often darted toward her father, searching for a clue in the tense set of his shoulders or the line of his jaw. Harold stood by the hearth, staring at the fire as though it could reveal a way to undo what he had done. Clara's innocence clashed sharply with the shadow over Harold. Every gesture, every glance she gave him, carried the weight of trust that he had already compromised. She noticed the way his hands trembled when he lifted the kettle, the way his eyes lingered on her as if measuring the consequences of an invisible crime. She could not name it, but her instincts were sharp. Something had shifted, something heavier than the cold air pressing through the cracked windows. Harold tried to speak, tried to offer calm words, but every syllable tasted like ash. "Oh, you'll be safe, Clara," he said, voice low. She nodded, sensing the tension, and returned to her chores. Yet even as she moved, her small heart began to notice the difference, the quiet, the unease, the pauses that had never been there before. The weight of her father's guilt hung in the room like a shadow she could feel, even if she could not see. The snow outside glimmered with harsh light, reflecting the severity of the winter that mirrored Harold's conscience. Each step he took across the frozen yard, each glance at the animals, each adjustment of the fences, was a reminder of the life he had sold. Every coin in his pocket felt heavier, pressing against his ribs, a constant reminder that he had traded Clara's freedom for temporary survival. The comfort of the farm, the promise of stability, were hollow. The cruelty of his choice had already taken root, and he could feel it growing, spreading into every interaction. Clara began asking questions more often, probing the boundaries of what she did not understand. "Father," she said one morning, "why do we have to visit the Millers again? Do they like me?" Harold froze, the words slicing through him. How could he explain that she had already been measured, evaluated, and promised to a household that might never truly consider her heart? They will be kind," he said finally, hiding the tremor in his voice. She nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on him, sharp with curiosity and the faintest hint of unease. The days passed in a tense rhythm. Harold moved through them mechanically, tending animals, mending fences, preparing food, yet his thoughts never left Clara. Every laugh she offered, every question she asked, every glance she gave carried a sting of guilt. He imagined the Millers' polite smiles, the rules and manners they expected, the strict household where obedience would soon outweigh freedom. Each image pressed down on him, a reminder that he had chosen survival over morality, coins over trust. One afternoon, Clara lingered near the barn, watching him repair the fence. "Father," she said, "do you ever worry about things?" Harold paused, hands frozen over the wooden post. The question struck him with unexpected force. He looked at her small face, the innocence in her bright eyes, and felt a pang that went deeper than any winter chill. "I worry for you," he said finally, careful not to betray everything. She nodded, her brow furrowed slightly, sensing more than he could admit. The letters from the Millers arrived with increasing regularity, polite and meticulous. Each one outlined expectations, duties, and the care they promised Clara. Harold read them endlessly, each word sinking deeper into his conscience. Comfort could not erase the reality of what he had done. Safety could not undo the betrayal. Every promise felt like a reminder of the invisible shackles he had placed on his daughter's life, and the cruel arithmetic of desperation haunted him relentlessly. Clara's perception sharpened. She began noticing subtle patterns, the tone in her father's voice, the careful avoidance of certain subjects, the pause when he spoke of the Millers. She did not fully understand, yet the weight in the air pressed upon her, a quiet oppression that made her uneasy. Harold tried to shield her from the truth, but innocence has a way of sensing shadows even when the light is present. Night brought no comfort. Harold wandered the snow-laden yard, boots crunching in the frost, imagining Clara's life beyond his care. Each visual he conjured, the polished floors of the Miller's house, the obedience expected of her, the subtle measurements of behavior, was a blade against his heart. He understood that even in comfort, she would be constrained. He had traded her freedom for the illusion of security, and the cruelty of that choice gnawed at him without mercy. Inside, Clara slept fitfully, dreams laced with vague anxiety she could not name. Harold sat near her bed, memorizing the curve of her small hands, the way her chest rose and fell. He whispered to himself promises he could not fulfill, regrets that could not be undone. Every coin he had accepted in exchange for her future felt like a chain around his soul. He had sold his daughter, and each heartbeat reminded him that the cost could never be repaid. The following days brought the first signs of tension with the Millers. Samuel's polite but calculating nature became more pronounced, and Harold sensed that Clara's innocence would soon collide with the expectations of a household that measured worth differently. He imagined her adapting, obeying, conforming, and the thought made his chest tighten. He had forced her into a world where cruelty could masquerade as civility, and he could do nothing but watch. Clara's questions grew sharper still. She asked about the Miller's rules, about the chores she would perform, about the kind of life she would have. Harold offered careful reassurances, but each answer felt like another lie layered over the first. Her trust was absolute yet fragile, and he felt the sting of every unspoken truth pressing down. He had sold not only her freedom, but her certainty, her security in the one person who should have protected her above all else. The winter deepened. Snow blanketed the fields, the frost etched every surface, and the small house seemed smaller under the weight of unspoken truths. Harold moved through the days, haunted by the choice he had made, the cruelty he had enacted, and the relentless tide of regret that pressed upon him. Every interaction with Clara, every glance, every gesture became a test of endurance, a reminder of the life he had sold. The first night Clara packed for another visit. She carried her small bundle with quiet diligence. Harold helped, his hands shaking slightly as he folded garments and adjusted scarves. He tried to offer calm words. "They will be kind, Clara," but even as he spoke, he knew the words were hollow. The Miller's politeness could not erase the chains he had attached to her life. The innocence he had promised to protect was already shadowed by obligation, by arrangement, by a father's desperate choice. Clara paused, looking up at him, sensing the tightness in his chest, the hesitation in his voice. "Father, are you all right?" she asked softly. Harold swallowed hard, forcing a smile he could not feel. I am well," he said, yet the lie echoed through the room, heavy with guilt. Her small eyes held trust, and he felt the moral cruelty of his actions deepen. She had no idea that he had sold her future, and he feared the day she would. The fire burned low that night, shadows stretching across the room like long fingers. Harold sat near Clara's bed, staring into the flickering flame. He whispered promises he could not keep, regrets that would never fade. Each coin, each decision, each polite letter from the Millers weighed upon him, pressing relentlessly. He understood now that comfort was meaningless. When measured against innocence lost, that survival could never justify cruelty, and that the weight of regret was heavier than any coin he could count. And as the snow fell silently outside, Harold made a quiet, desperate promise to himself, to protect her in every small way he could, to try to shield her from harm, even if he could not undo the past. The house was silent except for the wind, yet within its walls, the echoes of betrayal, innocence, and regret collided endlessly. Clara's laughter, her small gestures, the trust she offered, freely all contrasted sharply, with the father who had sold her future and now carried the relentless burden of conscience. Clara moved through the house with cautious steps, her small hands lingering on the edges of tables and windowsills, as though touching them might reveal hidden truths. She had begun noticing patterns, subtle yet persistent, that suggested the life around her was governed by invisible rules she did not yet understand. Harold watched her from a distance, heart heavy, guilt twisting with every glance. He could see the flicker of unease in her eyes, the way she hesitated before speaking, the careful deliberation in her movements. It was a reflection of the shadow he had cast over her life. He had tried to shield her, to offer reassurance, but the weight of his own conscience made every word falter. "Clara, you will be fine," he would say. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. He could feel the truth pressing beneath the surface, an invisible force that neither wealth nor preparation could suppress. Every decision he had made now loomed over him like a spectre, and he could not escape the knowledge that he had sold the one person he loved most. The snow continued to blanket Millersfield, thick and unyielding. Outside, the cold was sharp, cutting through coats and boots alike. Inside, Harold moved mechanically, tending to chores, carrying wood, and mending fences, yet each action reminded him of the cruel bargain he had struck. Clara's innocent chatter, once a source of comfort, now pierced him with the stark contrast between her world of freedom and the world he had promised her at the Millers. Every smile, every question, every fleeting gesture of curiosity carried a weight he could not bear. Clara began asking more pointed questions about the Millers. "Father, will they let me play outside?" she asked one day, eyes wide with concern. Harold's stomach twisted. He had imagined this exact moment countless times, and each time it felt unbearable. "Yes, they will let you," he said finally, forcing the words to sound confident. But he knew that her days would soon be measured, policed by expectations, manners, and subtle rules that would replace the freedom she had once known. The cruel reality of what he had done pressed against his chest like iron bands. Letters arrived again, polite and precise, outlining schedules, rules and expectations. Harold read them repeatedly, each line driving the point deeper into his mind. Clara's life was no longer entirely her own. She would be observed, evaluated, shaped according to the Millers' standards. The comfort he had sought for her could not erase the moral cost, nor could it ease the gnawing guilt that consumed him daily. He had traded innocence for security, and the exchange was irreversible. Clara, too, began sensing the subtle shifts. She noticed how her father flinched when certain subjects came up, how he avoided eye contact when speaking of the Millers, how the lines of his face deepened when she asked simple questions. Her trust in him was unwavering, yet the unease lingered like a quiet storm, whispering that all was not as it seemed. She could not articulate the danger, yet her instincts told her that something had changed irrevocably. One afternoon, Clara lingered in the kitchen, watching Harold as he repaired a broken chair. "Father, why do you look so sad sometimes?" she asked, small voice hesitant. Harold froze, hammer in hand. He wanted to tell her, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words refused him. He could only sigh, setting the hammer down with care. "I worry for you, Clara," he said finally, choosing the least damaging truth he could offer. She nodded, thoughtful, then returned to her chores. Yet the question remained, lingering in the air, heavy and unresolved. The winter deepened further. Snow pressed against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Harold wandered the fields alone, boots crunching against ice, imagining Clara under the miller's roof. Each polite smile she would offer, each expectation she would be forced to meet, each measure of obedience, he imagined them all, and they cut him to the core. He had forced her into a world of subtle cruelty, where her innocence would be tested and measured, and he could do nothing to stop it. At night he sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. Clara slept fitfully, and he memorized the rise and fall of her chest, the curl of her small hands. He whispered to himself silent promises of protection, knowing they could do little to undo the betrayal he had enacted. Each coin he had counted, each agreement he had made, each polite arrangement with the Millers all pressed down on him like a relentless tide. He had sold his daughter, and the consequences were now as real as the frost outside. Clara began to observe the world with new awareness. She noticed the slight hesitation in her father's step, the careful restraint in his voice, the quiet tension that threaded through the house. She did not yet understand fully, but the instinct of a child sensing imbalance was sharp. She began to linger near him, asking questions in ways she hoped might draw answers, trying to probe the hidden weight she could feel pressing against every moment of their days. The miller's letters grew increasingly formal, outlining expectations, schedules, and the rules of their household. Harold read each line with a growing sense of despair. Comfort could not erase the betrayal. Safety could not undo the moral cost. Each promise was a reminder that Clara's life was no longer entirely her own, that she was now subject to arrangements he had chosen, and that every day he had left her innocence in the hands of strangers was another day, steeped in cruelty. Clara, sensing tension she could not yet name, began asking questions that revealed her growing understanding. "Father, will they be strict with me?" she asked one evening, small hands clutching the edge of the table. Harold's heart twisted. The answer was yes, though kindness and polite treatment would mask it. He forced a calm voice. "They will treat you well. Clara, you will see." Yet he knew that every rule, every expectation, every polite smile would carry the weight of obedience, and her freedom would slowly shrink under it. The snow lay heavy on the fields, and the cold seeped through the walls of the stone house. Harold moved through the chores with mechanical precision, haunted by every decision, every coin, every promise he had made. Clara's laughter, her small gestures, the lightness of her presence, all reminded him of the innocence he had betrayed. Every polite interaction, every careful word, every shielded explanation was layered with the cruelty of circumstance and the inexorable pull of regret. Even in small ordinary moments, the tension grew. Clara asked about the miller's expectations, the chores she would perform, the rules she would follow. Harold offered careful reassurances, but each answer carried the weight of deception. Her trust was unwavering yet fragile, and he felt the sting of every lie pressing into him. He had sold her future, and the burden of that cruelty pressed down relentlessly, a constant shadow in the quiet of their home. At night he would walk the frozen yard, imagining the miller's home, imagining the obedience required, imagining the polite smiles and strict measures. Each vision twisted his gut. Each imagined detail tightened the coils of regret around his heart. He had bartered her freedom for security, and the moral cost was now a permanent resident in his conscience. There would be no relief, no undoing, no escape. And yet even amidst despair, Harold tried to act. He lingered close to Clara, offered small comforts, small protections, knowing that he could not undo the past but determined to preserve what innocence remained. He watched her carefully, memorizing every detail, whispering promises he could not fully keep, hoping that small acts of love might mitigate the cruelty he had already unleashed. Every snow-filled morning, Every frozen field, every creak of the stone. House reminded him of the life he had sold and the innocence he had betrayed. Clara's growing awareness, though subtle, sharpened his guilt. Each glance she cast his way, each question she asked, each hesitation in her movements was a mirror, reflecting the weight of the decision he could never reverse. The cruelty of circumstance and his own choices had woven a complex web, and he was trapped within it as surely as she would soon be. The winter wind had grown sharper, cutting through Millersfield with a bite that made even the hardiest bones ache. Inside the small stone house, Harold moved more slowly now, the weight of guilt pressing on him like an invisible stone. Every step reminded him of the choice he had made, the cruel bargain that had placed Clara's innocence into the hands of strangers. He could no longer ignore it, could no longer tell himself that the money and promises could undo what had been done. Clara's perception had grown keen. She noticed subtle signs that troubled her. The way Harold's eyes lingered too long on the fire, the hesitations in his voice, the tight line of his lips when she asked about the Millers. She could not yet understand fully, but instinct told her that something was amiss. There was a weight in the air, a tension that had not existed before, and it pressed against her small chest with every movement. One morning, while helping him mend a fence, she spoke quietly, almost as if afraid to break the fragile calm. "Father, do you ever wish things could be different?" Harold froze. The hammer in his hands felt heavy, each swing of it a reminder of the moral burden he carried. "Sometimes," he said finally, voice barely audible. The admission tasted bitter, yet it was the closest thing to truth he could give. Clara did not press further, sensing the weight behind his words, the invisible chains of regret that bound him. The letters from the Millers had grown stricter in tone. Rules were emphasized, chores outlined with precision, and polite expectations were laid bare in ways that made Harold's stomach twist. Each line reminded him that he had placed Clara in a household that would measure her worth in manners and obedience, not innocence. The comfort he had sought for her was hollow, the promise of care nothing more than a polite veil over the moral cost he bore. Clara's questions became sharper. "Father, will they make me do things I don't want?" she asked one evening, small hands clenched around the edge of the table. Harold's chest tightened. He forced a calm voice. "They will only ask you to follow their rules. Clara, you will be safe." Yet the words rang hollow even to him. Safety could not erase the subtle cruelty of expectation, the loss of freedom, the inevitable shaping of a child's life according to another's design. He had sold her future, and the sting of it now gnawed at every moment. Each day Harold found himself watching her more closely. He memorized her small gestures, the tilt of her head, the rise and fall of her chest, the curve of her tiny hands. He whispered silent apologies to her in moments when she could not hear, promises that he could not fulfill. Every coin he had accepted, every polite agreement with the Millers, weighed on him like iron chains. He understood fully now that he had traded her innocence for temporary comfort, and the cruelty of that act could not be undone. The snow pressed relentlessly against the windows, a constant reminder of the frozen, unyielding path he had set for Clara. He moved through his chores mechanically, yet every step carried the invisible weight of his own conscience. Each interaction with Clara, once a source of joy, was now tinged with the bitter knowledge of betrayal. Her innocence contrasted sharply with the consequences of his actions, and he could feel the tension coiling in the small house like a living thing. One night, Clara lingered near him, asking questions about the Millers and their household. "Will they be strict with me? Will I have to do everything exactly as they say?" Harold's hands trembled. He wanted to tell her the truth, to warn her of the subtle cruelty she would face, but he could not. Words could not undo the moral debt, could not protect her from the consequences of his choice. He only nodded, forcing reassurance into his voice. "They will be kind, Clara, you will see." The lie settled between them, heavy and suffocating. The days grew colder, the snow heavier, and Harold's guilt deeper. He watched Clara play quietly, small gestures carrying the weight of unspoken questions. She had begun to notice the inconsistencies in his behavior, the hesitation, the tightness, the occasional tremor in his voice. Her trust was still intact, yet fragile, and every interaction reminded Harold of the cruelty he had enacted and the life he had sold. Letters from the Millers arrived again, outlining schedules and expectations with polite precision. Harold read them repeatedly, each line driving home the cost of his choice. Comfort could not erase the moral consequences. Safety could not absolve the cruelty. Each promise was a reminder that Clara's life was no longer entirely her own, and that he had placed her in a household where obedience would soon outweigh freedom. The weight of regret pressed down relentlessly, a constant reminder of what he had done. Clara's curiosity sharpened. She asked about the Millers' expectations, the chores she would perform, and the rules she would follow. Harold offered careful reassurances, but every word carried the weight of deception. Her trust, once absolute, now trembled on the edge of awareness. He had sold her future, and the burden of cruelty pressed down relentlessly, shaping every moment of their days. The nights were the worst. Harold wandered the snow-laden yard, boots crunching against ice, imagining Clara under the Miller's roof. Every polite smile, every expected act of obedience, every measured gesture of politeness. He imagined them all, and they cut him deeply. He had forced her into a world of subtle cruelty, and there was nothing he could do to shield her completely. The snow fell silently around him, mirroring the quiet storm of regret that would not abate. Even small moments inside the house carried tension. Clara asked about chores, about expectations, about the Miller's rules. Harold answered cautiously, asking the depth of cruelty inherent in each requirement, each polite command. He could feel the consequences of his decision pressing down like snow on a roof, heavy and unyielding. Her innocence, still intact in many ways, was shadowed by the reality he had set in motion. And yet he tried. He lingered close to Clara, offering small protections, guiding her gently, whispering silent apologies, promising that he would do everything he could to shield her from harm. Every coin he had counted, every arrangement he had made, every polite letter from the Millers. The moral weight was relentless, yet he endured it, knowing that the cruelty he had enacted could not be undone, but that small acts of love might offer fragments of protection. By the fire, Harold sat late into the night, memorizing every detail of Clara, her small hands, the curve of her shoulders, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she slept. He whispered silent promises, knowing that no comfort or coin could fully undo the damage. The snow outside fell heavy and silent, a mirror to the moral storm within. The cruelty of his decision, the betrayal of trust, and the relentless weight of regret pressed upon him with every heartbeat, every breath. Clara's awareness deepened. She noticed patterns she could not yet name, sensed the tension, the hesitation, the invisible weight pressing upon the household. Her questions became sharper, her observations more precise, her instincts telling her that life was not as simple as it had seemed. She could not yet fully understand the cruelty, yet she sensed it, and it pressed against her small chest with a weight that made her cautious in every movement. Harold felt the tightening coil of guilt in every glance, every smile, every word spoken to her. He understood fully now the consequences of the choice he had made, the depth of cruelty inherent in selling her future, the irreversible nature of his actions. Each step he took, each chore completed, each moment spent with her, was now infused with the constant awareness of betrayal and regret. The frost-covered fields outside, Miller's Field stretched endlessly under the pale winter sun, and inside the stone house, silence pressed upon every corner. Clara moved cautiously through the rooms, senses sharpened by months of subtle observation. She had begun noticing details that had previously escaped her, the tense set of her father's shoulders, the quick intake of his breath at certain questions, the way he avoided direct eye contact when speaking of the Millers. Her innocence had been intact for so long, yet the weight of unspoken truths pressed upon her now with quiet insistence. Harold watched her closely, heart heavy with the knowledge that his choices had set this moment in motion. Every glance, every gesture from Clara reminded him of the cruelty he had enacted, the betrayal that could not be undone. The snow outside seemed to mirror his conscience, cold, unyielding, and endless. He could not speak the full truth, yet every fiber of his being ached with remorse. He had sold his daughter, traded her freedom for fleeting comfort, and now faced the full, relentless weight of consequence. Clara's curiosity became more pointed. "Father," she said one morning, her small voice steady despite the questions building in her mind, "why do I feel like I'm always waiting for something to happen?" Harold froze, the question cutting deeper than the sharpest winter wind. He had tried to shield her, to offer reassurances, but each word felt fragile and hollow. "It's just life," he said finally, choosing the least harmful truth. Yet he knew that the world he had thrust her into was measured, controlled and shaped by rules she did not yet fully see. The letters from the Millers had grown more precise, more formal, outlining the chores, the expectations, the polite but unyielding structure of her new life. Harold read them over and over, each one pressing the moral weight deeper into his conscience. Comfort could not erase cruelty. Safety could not undo betrayal. Every polite promise carried the shadow of the choice he had made, every word a reminder of the innocence he had sold. Clara noticed the tension, though she did not yet understand its source. She observed the small hesitations, the quiet sighs, the lines of worry etched across her father's face. Her trust was unwavering, yet tempered now with instinctual awareness. She began asking questions that revealed this growing perception. About rules, about expectations, about the Millers' household. Each query pierced Harold's heart, a reflection of the cruelty he had enacted and the consequence he could not escape. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Clara spoke softly, almost in a whisper, "Father, will I ever be free to choose for myself?" Harold's hands trembled. He wanted to speak truth, to confess the depths of his error, to beg for forgiveness. But words could not undo the life he had sold. He could only offer what comfort he could muster. "You will always have my love," he said finally, voice raw. "I cannot undo what has been done, but I will protect you as best I can." The snow outside fell silently, heavy and unyielding, as if mirroring the moral storm within him. Every thought, every glance, every silent breath reminded Harold of the cruelty he had enacted. Clara's trust, innocence, and growing awareness pressed upon him with relentless force. He could see the future in sharp relief: polite smiles, measured actions, constrained freedom, and the subtle shaping of her character by forces beyond her control. Yet amidst despair, Harold continued to act. He lingered close to Clara, offering guidance, small comforts, whispered reassurances. Each gesture, each small act of protection, was a fragile attempt to mitigate the cruelty he had already set in motion. He memorized every detail: her hands, the tilt of her head, the rise and fall of her chest in sleep, hoping that these small protections might preserve fragments of innocence in a world that would demand conformity and obedience. Clara's awareness sharpened further. She noticed inconsistencies, the tension in her father's movements, the hesitations in his voice. She asked more pointed questions, probing the boundaries of what she could understand. Harold answered cautiously, masking the depth of cruelty in every arrangement, every polite rule, every expected behavior. Her trust remained, yet now it carried the subtle weight of discernment. She sensed the world was more complex, more constrained, and that her life had already been shaped by decisions beyond her control. The days grew longer, the snow slowly giving way to the first hints of thaw. Harold felt the moral weight pressing less visibly but no less intensely. The cruelty of selling Clara's freedom, the betrayal of trust, and the relentless gnaw of regret had become a permanent part of him. He understood fully now that comfort could never erase wrongdoing, That survival could never justify the moral cost. Each day with her was both a blessing and a torment, a reminder of innocence lost and the effort to protect what remained. One afternoon, Clara lingered near him by the fire, small hands clasped in her lap. "Father, I don't understand everything," she said quietly, "but I feel it. I feel that things aren't as they should be." Harold's chest tightened. He could only nod, words failing him, heart heavy with the knowledge that she sensed, even without knowing fully, the consequences of his choices. Her instinct was sharp, her awareness profound, and it reflected the cruel reality he had enacted. The miller's letters continued to arrive, outlining expectations with polite precision. Harold read them, each line a reminder that her life would be structured, measured, constrained by rules and manners. The comfort he had sought for her could not erase the subtle cruelty inherent in each instruction. Each polite promise, each measured expectation, carried the moral weight of the choice he had made and the consequences that could not be reversed. Night fell, and the house was quiet except for the crackling fire. Harold sat by Clara's bed, memorizing every detail, whispering apologies that could not undo the past, promises that could not fully protect her. The snow outside lay heavy and silent, reflecting the moral storm that had settled within him. Cruelty had been enacted, innocence compromised, and the burden of regret was relentless and permanent. Clara's questions became fewer, replaced by careful observation. She noticed the pauses, the hidden sighs, the tension in each movement. Her awareness, though not complete, had sharpened into a quiet understanding. Harold could feel it in every glance, every step, every shared moment. He had sold her future, yet in the small ways he could, he tried to preserve what remained. Fragments of freedom, glimpses of choice, small acts of protection. The thaw began to melt the snow outside, and the first rays of sun broke through the grey winter sky. Harold and Clara stood together, small hands resting on each other, watching the transformation of the fields. The innocence of spring seemed distant, yet he clung to it as a fragile hope. He had inflicted cruelty, yet he would endure the relentless weight of regret to shield her in every way he could. And in that moment, Harold understood the final truth. He could not undo the past, could not reclaim what he had sold, but he could act in the present. Each day with Clara, each whispered comfort, each small protection was an attempt to balance the scales of morality, to offer fragments of love and care in a world that had demanded obedience and conformity. As the fire burned low that night, Harold whispered a final thought, one that would accompany him always. He would protect Clara, honor her trust as best he could, and carry the weight of regret as a constant reminder of the cruelty he had enacted. The snow, now melting, reflected the small glimmers of hope that remained, yet the shadow of choice, betrayal, and moral consequence would linger forever. Clara lay asleep, unaware of the full scope of the decisions that had shaped her life, yet sensing the subtle weight of responsibility and care that lingered in the quiet moments of the house. Harold watched over her, memorizing every detail, whispering silent apologies, and holding steadfast to the moral duty he could still fulfill. And as the night deepened, the story closed gently, the winter passing into spring, the shadow of regret lingering, and the bonds of love and protection enduring, fragile yet unbroken. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from.